My husband said I need to find myself before grabbing his suitcase and heading to a hotel with his mistress. Just a few hours later, right in the middle of their affair, he suffered a massive stroke. When he woke up in the hospital, he could not move a single part of his body. Our daughter burst into his hospital room in tears. "Dad," she choked out, "while you were gone, Mom." A few seconds later, his face turned deathly pale. Before I tell you how my husband went from a high-flying corporate consultant to a paralyzed prisoner of his own arrogance, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe karma never misses an address. The heavy thud of a designer leather suitcase hitting the hardwood floor echoed through our sprawling estate in Buckhead. I stood at the bottom of our curved mahogany staircase, holding a simple copper watering can. I had just finished tending to my indoor ferns, enjoying the quiet peace of a Tuesday morning. That peace shattered the moment I looked up. Malik, my husband of 18 years, stood on the landing. He was dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. His designer watch caught the morning sunlight, casting a harsh glare across the walls. He walked down the steps with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if he were presenting a keynote speech to a room full of eager executives. His jaw was set tight, and his eyes held a mixture of absolute contempt and arrogant victory. I did not say a word as he reached the bottom step. I simply watched him. I knew this moment was coming. I had been preparing for it in total silence for over a year. Malik reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He did not hand it to me gently. He threw it onto the entry table where it slid and stopped right next to a vase of fresh hydrangeas. "Take a good look at that, Roxanne," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I set my watering can down carefully. I picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a printed statement from our joint bank account. The balance, which had taken years to accumulate, showed a massive withdrawal. $500,000 had been transferred out early that morning. The remaining balance was barely enough to cover the monthly utility bills for a house of this size. I looked at the numbers, and then I looked up at the man I had married. "I am leaving Roxanne," he announced, puffing his chest out. "I am going to the Four Seasons downtown for the week. Then I am buying a penthouse in Midtown. I need to find myself. I need to be around people who actually match my ambition." I kept my face perfectly still. I did not scream. I did not throw the paper back at him. I simply folded it and placed it back on the table. "You are going to find yourself at a luxury hotel," I asked, my voice quiet and even. "Are you going alone, Malik?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. He shook his head as if he found my calmness insulting. "I am going with Brittany," he said, boldly, throwing his mistress's name into the open air as if it were a badge of honor. "Brittany actually understands my corporate vision. She is young, she is hungry, and she knows what it takes to survive in high society. She does not spend her weekends digging in the dirt planting vegetables we can afford to buy at luxury markets. She belongs in the world I have built." The blatant disrespect in his tone was meant to crush me. He wanted to see me fall to my knees. He wanted me to beg him to stay. He wanted the satisfaction of knowing he had completely destroyed the woman he had promised to love. Instead, I felt a strange sense of liberation wash over me. "You think you are so much better than me, do you not, Malik?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. He took a step closer, towering over me with a look of absolute disgust. "I know I am better than you, Roxanne. Look at you. You are wearing a plain cotton dress. You have no drive. You have no ambition. I pulled you out of that dusty Gullah Geechee farmhouse in South Carolina. I gave you a real life. I put you in Atlanta high society. I introduced you to country clubs and charity galas. And what do? You still act like a maid. You cook your own meals instead of hiring a private chef. You refuse to wear the designer labels I bought you. You are small, Roxanne. You have a small mind and a small life. I am a partner-level corporate consultant. I make million-dollar deals over breakfast. I cannot be tied down to a woman who is content with being a nobody." His words were sharp, designed to cut directly into my heritage and my pride. He had always hated my roots. My family came from generations of proud, hardworking black farmers in the Low Country. We understood the value of land, the value of silence, and the value of true generational wealth. Malik, on the other hand, came from a family obsessed with flashy appearances. His mother, Gloria, was entirely consumed by the illusion of black excellence. To them, success was not about what you actually owned. It was about the logos you wore and the cars you leased to impress people who did not even like you. I listened to his rant without interrupting. I let him inflate his own ego because I knew something he did not. I knew that the $500,000 he had just triumphantly withdrawn was not liquid cash. I knew it was a high-interest margin loan he had secretly taken out against a hedge fund managed by his arrogant white brother-in-law, Chad. Malik thought he was securing his freedom and impressing his young mistress. In reality, he had just strapped a financial bomb to his own chest. "Are you entirely finished, Malik?" I asked. He sneered at me, clearly frustrated that I was not breaking down. My calmness agitated him. He grabbed the handle of his designer suitcase. "I am done with you, Roxanne. My lawyer will send the divorce papers to this house tomorrow. Do not try to fight me in court. You do not have the money to afford decent representation now. You will take whatever settlement I offer, and you will be grateful for it." He turned around and started walking toward the massive oak front doors. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of his own perceived power. He thought he had planned the perfect escape. He thought he had left me destitute and humiliated. "Malik." I called out just as his hand touched the brass doorknob. He stopped and glanced back over his shoulder, an arrogant smirk playing on his lips. "What is it, Roxanne? Are you finally going to beg?" I walked over to the entry table and picked up my watering can. "No," I replied smoothly. "But you have my spare set of keys to the black Range Rover in your jacket pocket. I am going to need those back." His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. He stared at me as if I had lost my mind. I had just discovered my husband was leaving me for a 26-year-old marketing associate. I had just learned my bank account was drained, and my only response was to ask for my car keys. "You are pathetic," he spat out, shaking his head in disgust. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the heavy key fob, and threw it onto the hardwood floor. It clattered against the wood, sliding all the way to my feet. "Keep the damn keys, Roxanne. Brittany is picking me up in her Mercedes anyway. Have a nice life in your little garden." He opened the heavy oak door and slammed it shut behind him. The sound echoed through the empty foyer. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the central air conditioning. I reached down and picked up my keys, dropping them into my pocket. I did not shed a single tear. I felt no urge to scream or throw things. My heart rate had not even elevated. I simply picked up my copper watering can and walked back into the sunroom to finish tending to my ferns. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm, golden glow over the green leaves. I felt incredibly peaceful. For years, Malik had treated me like a simple-minded housewife. He assumed my quiet nature meant I lacked intelligence. He mistook my refusal to buy flashy designer bags for a lack of sophistication. He did not know that every Tuesday when I told him I was attending a neighborhood book club, I was actually sitting at the head of a mahogany conference table in a high-rise building downtown. He did not know that the community gardening grants I managed were actually multi-million-dollar real estate acquisitions. He had no idea that I was the anonymous founder of a private equity firm that controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. I had built an empire in total silence. I hid my wealth behind layers of legal LLCs and corporate trusts because I knew exactly who Malik was. I saw his greed early in our marriage. I watched how his mother, Gloria, demanded expensive gifts and treated me like a peasant simply because I preferred homemade meals over Michelin star restaurants. I watched how his sister Trina and her condescending husband Chad flaunted their borrowed wealth. I knew that if I ever revealed my true financial power, they would suck me dry. So I played the role of the docile, grateful wife. I let Malik pay the utility bills and boast about his corporate salary while I quietly bought the very buildings his company leased. I went into the kitchen and put the kettle on the stove. I prepared a cup of Earl Grey tea, letting the aromatic steam rise into the air. I took my teacup back to the sunroom and sat in my favorite wicker chair, looking out over the manicured lawn. I knew Malik was currently checking into a luxury suite downtown with Brittany. I knew he was likely pouring champagne and making grand promises about the future they would share. I also knew that the clock was ticking. 3 hours passed. The house was blissfully quiet. My 16-year-old daughter Layla was safely at her elite boarding school, completing her midterms. Layla was the only person in this family with my blood and my spirit. She had my sharp mind and my ability to see through deception. She knew exactly what kind of man her father was, and she knew the truth about my business. We had an understanding. We were simply waiting for Malik to hang himself with his own rope. I took another sip of my tea. The digital clock on the mantel read 2 in the afternoon. Suddenly, the shrill ring of the house phone shattered the silence. It was not my personal cell phone. It was the landline, a number strictly reserved for emergencies. I set my teacup down on the saucer with a soft clink. I walked over to the wall-mounted phone and lifted the receiver. "Hello," I answered, my voice calm and collected. "Is this Mrs. Roxanne Sterling?" a woman asked. Her voice was clipped professional and laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "Speaking," I replied. "This is Atlanta General Hospital calling from the intensive care unit. We need you to come down immediately, Mrs. Sterling. Your husband Malik has been brought in by ambulance." I leaned against the wall, examining my fingernails. "What seems to be the problem?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. There was a slight hesitation on the other end of the line. The nurse was clearly not expecting such a calm reaction from a wife receiving an emergency call. "He has suffered a massive stroke," the nurse explained, her voice dropping to a serious clinical register. "He collapsed at a hotel downtown. The paramedics brought him in about 40 minutes ago. He is currently stabilized, but his condition is critical. We need his next of kin present to discuss medical directives and immediate surgical interventions." A stroke. Right in the middle of his luxury getaway with his young, ambitious mistress. The universe had a fascinating way of delivering justice before I even had to lift a finger. "I understand," I said smoothly. "I will be there shortly." I hung up the phone. I did not rush. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened my closet. I bypassed the plain cotton dresses Malik despised so much. I reached into the back and pulled out a sharp, impeccably tailored black blazer and matching trousers. I slipped into a pair of black leather pumps. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I did not look like a grieving housewife. I looked like a woman preparing to attend a corporate liquidation. I grabbed my leather handbag, making sure I had my legal folder tucked safely inside. I walked out of the sprawling suburban house that Malik thought he controlled, locking the heavy front door behind me. I climbed into my black SUV and pulled out of the driveway, heading toward downtown Atlanta. Malik had walked out this morning demanding freedom and claiming he was a titan of his industry. He had thrown away our marriage for an illusion of grandeur. Now he was lying in a hospital bed, entirely dependent on machines. The war he thought he had won by walking out the door was actually just beginning. And as I drove toward the hospital, I prepared myself to face the chaos his family was about to unleash. They were going to try to assert their dominance. They were going to try to crush me. But they had absolutely no idea that they were walking straight into a trap I had been setting for years. The drive to Atlanta General Hospital was remarkably quiet. I watched the city skyline emerge through my windshield while the radio played a soft jazz station. Most wives would be speeding, running red lights, and crying frantically over the steering wheel. But I was not most wives, and Malik was no longer the husband I had married. He had walked out of our home just hours ago demanding freedom and claiming he was a titan of his industry. Now he was lying in a hospital bed, entirely dependent on the medical staff. I pulled my black SUV into the parking garage, taking a moment to smooth the lapels of my tailored blazer. I did not look like a broken woman. I looked exactly as I felt, which was completely in control. The stark contrast between my peaceful sunroom and the sterile, blinding lights of the intensive care unit hit me the moment I stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor. The air smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. Before I could even approach the nurse's station, a piercing voice echoed down the long white corridor. "There she is." The voice belonged to Gloria, my mother-in-law. She was marching toward me with a speed that defied her 65 years. Gloria was dressed in her usual country club attire, wearing a silk blouse and heavy gold jewelry that clinked with every aggressive step she took. Right behind her was my sister-in-law, Trina, wiping her eyes with a tissue but making sure not to ruin her expensive makeup. Gloria did not stop when she reached me. She lunged forward and brought her hand down hard on my shoulder, slapping me with enough force to make me take a step back. I stood my ground, keeping my face perfectly still. "You did this to him," Gloria shouted, pointing a manicured finger in my face. "You stressed my son into a stroke with your endless nagging. You could not keep a successful black man happy, so you pushed him until his body simply gave out." I looked at the hand that had just struck me and then looked directly into Gloria's eyes. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked if she was quite finished making a scene in a public hospital. My calmness only infuriated her more. Trina stepped up beside her mother, crossing her arms over her designer jacket. "Mom is right, Roxanne. Malik has been miserable for months. He works 80-hour weeks to provide you with a mansion and a luxury lifestyle, and you just wander around your garden acting like you are still living in some dirt-poor rural town. You do not appreciate anything he does for this family." Gloria nodded vigorously, her gold earrings swaying. "I always told him he was marrying beneath his station. I told him when he brought you from that dusty low-country farm that you would never understand what it takes to support a man of his caliber. He gave you the world, and you rewarded him by being a cold, ungrateful wife. He is lying in a hospital bed right now because of you." I let them speak. I let them pour out years of pent-up resentment and coded insults. They truly believed I was a simple-minded country girl who had struck gold by marrying a corporate consultant. They had no idea that the mansion Trina was currently living in was financed by a bank that my private equity firm had recently acquired. They only saw what Malik allowed them to see. Before I could formulate a response, a man stepped between us holding an iPad. It was Chad, my white brother-in-law, married to Trina. He was wearing his signature fleece vest over a button-down shirt, looking every bit the arrogant hedge fund manager he claimed to be. He held his hands up in a calming gesture, but the look in his eyes was pure condescension. "Ladies, please," Chad said, using his corporate negotiation voice. "This is a highly stressful medical emergency. We need to focus on logistics, not emotions." He turned his attention to me, looking down his nose as if I were a confused intern. "Roxanne, you need to step aside and let me handle this," Chad told me, tapping the screen of his iPad. "The medical directives and insurance logistics involved in a catastrophic neurological event are highly complex. We are dealing with premium out-of-network providers and intricate corporate healthcare policies that Malik has through his firm. These financial and legal matters are completely beyond your comprehension. I am going to step in as the man of the family and coordinate with the neurosurgeons." I stared at him. Chad had always enjoyed mansplaining finances to me at family dinners. He loved using big words to describe basic economic concepts, assuming my silence meant I was struggling to understand. "Is that so, Chad?" I asked, my voice smooth and quiet. He sighed, as if explaining math to a child. "Yes, Roxanne. Stick to your little community garden projects. Let someone with a Wharton degree handle the adult's business. I have already contacted my legal team to review his corporate assets and ensure his care is fully covered by his premium executive plans. You just sit in the waiting room and let us manage the heavy lifting." I slowly crossed my arms. The community garden projects he was mocking were actually massive commercial real estate tracts that my holding company was currently developing into mixed-use properties. But I kept that information to myself. I watched Chad strut over to the nurse's station, demanding to speak with the chief of neurology, because his brother-in-law was a high-net-worth individual who required VIP treatment. Gloria and Trina found seats in the waiting area, whispering to each other and shooting me poisonous glares. I chose to stand near the large glass windows overlooking the city streets below. I knew that the executive health plans Chad was bragging about were tied to Malik's employment contract. I also knew that Malik was drowning in hidden debt and his corporate standing was not as secure as he had led his family to believe. Minutes dragged into an hour. The tension in the hallway grew thick and suffocating. Chad kept pacing back and forth, checking his phone and complaining loudly about the lack of communication from the medical staff. Gloria was crying softly now, dabbing her eyes and praying out loud for her successful, beautiful son to make a full recovery. I simply waited. I knew there was a piece of this puzzle still missing. Malik had not been alone when he collapsed. The hospital had called me because I was his wife on paper, but the paramedics would have picked him up from the hotel room where he was meeting his mistress. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open. The entire family turned to look, expecting a doctor in a white coat to deliver the news. Instead, a young woman walked out into the hallway. It was Brittany. She was 26 years old, wearing a silk slip dress that was clearly meant for a romantic hotel stay. Her blonde hair was a messy tangle, and mascara streamed down her cheeks in thick, dark lines. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her chest heaving with every breath. Gloria stood up so fast, her chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. "Who are you?" Gloria demanded, her voice sharp and defensive. "What were you doing in my son's room?" Brittany looked at the gathered family with wide, terrified eyes. She clutched a crumpled piece of paper to her chest as if it were a shield. She looked past Gloria and Trina, and her eyes locked onto me. She knew exactly who I was. Malik had undoubtedly shown her my picture while complaining about his boring, uninspired wife. "I am Brittany!" She choked out, her voice shaking. "I was with Malik when it happened. We were at the hotel. He just grabbed his head and fell to the floor. It was awful. There was so much chaos." Trina gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "You were with him at a hotel." Gloria's eyes darted from Brittany to me, processing the reality of her son's infidelity. But rather than showing any sympathy toward me, Gloria immediately adjusted her loyalties. She looked at Brittany's expensive designer bag and the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. In Gloria's mind, any woman Malik deemed worthy of spending money on was suddenly a valid part of the equation. Chad stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked at the paper Brittany was holding. "Miss, you cannot be here," he said firmly. "This is a restricted medical area for immediate family only. We are discussing highly confidential medical and financial directives. You need to leave before I call security." Brittany shook her head violently, tears flying from her face. She held the crumpled piece of paper out toward Chad. "No, you do not understand," she cried, her voice echoing down the corridor. "He signed this before the ambulance came. He was having trouble speaking, but he knew what was happening. He insisted on signing it while we waited for the paramedics." Chad snatched the paper from her hands, his eyes scanning the messy, scrawled handwriting. I watched his face closely. I watched the arrogant confidence drain completely away, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization. "What does it say?" Trina asked, stepping closer to her husband. "What did my brother sign?" Chad looked up, his face pale. He swallowed hard before reading the words aloud to the silent hallway. He gave her medical and financial power of attorney. The silence that followed was absolute. Gloria stared at Brittany with her mouth open. Trina looked back and forth between the young mistress and the piece of paper. Chad stood frozen, his iPad hanging uselessly at his side. Brittany wiped her nose with the back of her hand, sobbing louder now. "He said he did not trust his wife to make the right choices for him," she cried. "He said I was the only one who understood his vision. He put me in charge of everything." I remained standing by the window, looking at the faces of the people who had just spent the last hour telling me how incompetent and unworthy I was. They had demanded I step aside. They had told me to let the adults handle the business. Now, a 26-year-old junior marketing associate in a silk slip dress held the legal keys to Malik's life and his supposed fortune. I took a slow, quiet breath. The trap was springing shut exactly as I had anticipated. Let them fight over the power. Let them fight over a man who had absolutely nothing left to his name. The silence in the intensive care hallway was absolute. The soft, rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors from the nearby rooms seemed to mock the total stillness of the people standing before me. Chad stared at his laptop screen, his mouth slightly open, unable to process the red warning banner that glared back at him. Brittany let out a sharp, trembling breath, clutching the power of attorney document as if it had suddenly turned into a live grenade. Gloria stepped forward, her gold bracelets rattling against her wrist. "Chad, what are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice tight with panic. "What do you mean the money is gone? My son is a senior consultant. He makes 7 figures. Just use another account." Chad did not look up from the screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, completely paralyzed. "I cannot," he whispered. "The federal margin call has locked everything attached to his social security number. It is all frozen." Before Gloria could unleash the full force of her denial, the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor swung open again. The hospital billing director returned, walking with a brisk, no-nonsense stride that signaled his patience had expired. He held a secondary clipboard and a wireless card terminal. "Excuse me, folks," the director said, stepping right up to Brittany. "We have prepped the surgical suite for Mr. Sterling, but the chief of neurosurgery will not scrub in until the financial hold is cleared. I need to run the card for the $50,000 deposit right now, miss. The window for preventing permanent brain damage is closing rapidly." Brittany physically recoiled from the man. She backed up against the wall, her silk slip dress suddenly looking incredibly cheap under the harsh hospital lighting. "I do not have it," she stammered, her eyes darting frantically around the hallway. "I am just a junior associate at his firm. I rent an apartment with 2 roommates. I cannot pay $50,000. The billing director frowned, looking down at the paperwork she had just signed. "Miss, you executed a durable power of attorney and signed the guarantor waiver just 10 minutes ago. You are legally responsible for this deposit and all ongoing care. If you cannot provide payment, we will be forced to transfer him to the county public hospital facility. They are currently operating at maximum capacity, and he will likely wait several hours in a hallway bed before seeing a resident physician." Gloria let out a horrified gasp. "A county hospital," she shrieked, grabbing her chest. "My son is not going to some underfunded charity ward. He is a prominent businessman. He belongs in the VIP surgical wing. Trina, tell your husband to pay the deposit right now." Trina grabbed Chad's arm, shaking him out of his shock. "Chad, just put it on the company black card," she pleaded. "We can figure it out later. Malik will pay you back when he recovers." Chad snatched his arm away from his wife, his face twisting with a sudden vicious anger. "Are you out of your mind, Trina?" he snapped. "I am not putting 50 grand of my firm's money on the line for a guy whose accounts were just seized by the federal government. Do you know what a margin call means? It means he was gambling with borrowed money and he lost everything." Brittany looked at the piece of paper in her hands, the document she had fought so hard to secure. She suddenly realized it was not a ticket to a luxury lifestyle. It was a financial death sentence. She lunged forward, thrusting the crumpled paper toward me. "Take it back," she cried, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Roxanne, you are his wife. You have to take it back. You have to pay for this. You live in that massive house in Buckhead. Just put it on your credit card." I looked at the trembling young woman and offered a slow, polite smile. I took a step back, putting my hands smoothly into the pockets of my tailored trousers. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Brittany," I replied, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "I signed the spousal liability waiver. You hold the proxy. He is your responsibility now. You wanted to be the woman who understood his corporate vision. It is time to step up and execute that vision." Chad slammed his laptop shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He turned to me, his face flushed with a dark, aggressive red. The thin veneer of the polite Wall Street professional was completely gone. He took 2 large steps toward me, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Listen to me, you arrogant woman," Chad growled, pointing a finger inches from my face. "You think you have outsmarted everyone here, but you are playing completely out of your league. You are legally his wife. I do not care what waiver you signed downstairs. I know exactly how to tear that waiver apart in a court of law." I held my ground, looking up at him with mild amusement. Is that so, Chad? I asked. Yes, it is, he sneered, his voice dripping with venom and unchecked racial entitlement. I work with lawyers who eat people like you for breakfast. You think you can just dump him on a junior employee and walk away scot-free? I will personally fund a lawsuit against you for spousal abandonment. I will tie you up in civil court for a decade. I will sue you for alimony on his behalf. I will force a judge to liquidate every single asset you have your name attached to. Gloria nodded triumphantly, stepping up beside Chad. That is right, Chad, she cheered. You tell her. She cannot just leave my son to rot. Chad leaned in closer, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. I know about that land your family owns down in South Carolina, Roxanne. That dusty little ancestral plot your great-grandfather left you. I will force a court order to seize it. I will make you sell that dirt to developers just to cover my brother's medical bills. You are going to pay for this one way or another. You are going to lose everything and end up right back in the projects where Malik found you. The hallway was dead silent. Trina looked smug. Gloria looked victorious. Brittany looked hopeful that someone else was going to take the fall. I looked at Chad. He had just threatened the one thing my family held sacred, our land. The acres of coastal property my ancestors had worked and bled for. He thought it was just dirt. He thought I was just a naive housewife who could be bullied by the threat of expensive white shoe lawyers. I slowly pulled my hands out of my pockets. I reached into my leather handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I opened it and removed a heavy document bound with blue legal tape. The pages were heavily redacted with thick black ink, but the signatures at the bottom of the final page were perfectly clear. I held the document out and placed it gently on the small rolling medical cart next to Chad's closed laptop. You are going to sue me for alimony, Chad? I asked, my voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous whisper. You are going to force me to sell my ancestral land. I suggest you read the second paragraph of page 4 before you make any more empty threats. Chad frowned, looking down at the document. He picked it up and flipped to the 4th page. His eyes scanned the text, and I watched his pupils dilate in absolute shock. What is it? Trina asked, her voice suddenly small. This is a post-nuptial agreement, Chad whispered, his hands beginning to shake. Yes, it is, I agreed smoothly. Signed and notarized 3 years ago. You see, Chad, my husband was never the financial genius you all believed him to be. 3 years ago, Malik decided he was smarter than the market. He took every cent of his legitimate corporate earnings and funneled it into highly speculative offshore crypto funds. He wanted to be a billionaire overnight. Instead, he lost 90% of his net worth in less than 4 months. Gloria gasped, clutching her chest. That is a lie, she stammered. My son is rich. He buys me designer bags every Christmas. He bought those bags on credit, Gloria, I corrected without looking at her. My eyes remained locked on Chad. When I discovered what he had done, I gave him a choice. We could divorce immediately and his humiliation would be public, or we could sign a post-nuptial agreement. This agreement legally separated all of our assets and liabilities. It completely indemnifies me from any debt he incurs and waives any right he has to alimony or my personal property. That includes my family's land. My assets are completely untouchable. Chad stared at the document, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. But the $500,000 he choked out. I saw the bank statements. He had liquid cash. I smiled a slow, genuine smile. Did you ever ask him where that $500,000 came from, Chad? Did you ever wonder how a man who was quietly drowning in credit card debt suddenly produced $500,000 in liquid capital this morning? Chad dropped the document onto the cart. His breathing became erratic. No. He whispered, his eyes wide with a sudden crushing panic. No, he could not have. Oh, but he did, I replied, my voice ringing clear and steady in the corridor. That $500,000 was a margin loan, Chad, a high-interest predatory margin loan, and he did not secure it with his own assets because he does not have any. He secured it using the internal access codes to your hedge fund. He leveraged your firm's institutional credit to fund his getaway with Brittany. Trina let out a loud, piercing scream. She grabbed Chad's arm, digging her acrylic nails into his fleece vest. Chad, tell me she is lying, Trina shrieked. Tell me my brother did not steal from your firm. Chad could not answer her. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the hallway as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. Malik had not just gone broke. He had committed massive corporate fraud, and he had left Chad holding the bag. Because Malik leveraged your specific portfolio. Chad. I continued outlining his doom with precise surgical detail. You are personally liable for that margin call. The federal regulators did not just freeze Malik's accounts. They tracked the origin of the collateral. When the market dipped this morning, and the margin call was triggered, the automated system liquidated the $500,000. But the penalty fees and the remaining balance of the fraudulent loan fall directly on the guarantor. And according to the digital trail Malik created, you are the guarantor. Brittany dropped the power of attorney paper on the floor and backed away, pressing her hands over her mouth. Gloria looked like she was going to faint, leaning heavily against the wall and staring at me in total horror. You set him up! Chad accused, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. You knew he was going to do this, and you let him. I gave a slight dismissive shrug. I simply stepped out of his way, Chad. Malik was so desperate to prove his superiority, so eager to fund his new life with his mistress, that he got sloppy. He thought he was outsmarting me. He thought he was outsmarting you. Instead, he financially ruined himself and took you down with him. The hospital billing director cleared his throat, stepping cautiously back into the center of the group. I am sorry to interrupt this family discussion, he said, looking nervously at Chad, but the chief of neurosurgery is waiting. Sir, if you are willing to use your corporate account to cover the deposit, we can proceed. Chad whirled on the administrator, his face contorted with panic. I cannot pay you, he yelled, losing completely the polished Wall Street persona he had worn like armor. I do not have $50,000 to give you. My brother-in-law just stole $500,000 from my firm. I have to call my compliance officer. I have to stop this before the board finds out. Chad grabbed his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it on the floor. He dialed a number and pressed the phone to his ear, pacing frantically away from his wife and his mother-in-law. Trina began to sob loudly, burying her face in her hands. Gloria stood paralyzed, her entire worldview shattering into tiny, irreparable pieces. The wealthy, successful son she had worshipped was a fraud. The luxurious life she had boasted about to her friends was a mirage built on stolen money and bad investments. I stood perfectly still, watching the chaos unfold. This was the exact sequence of events I had plotted in my mind for months. Every insult they had hurled at me, every condescending remark about my heritage and my intelligence had only fueled my silent preparation. They had believed I was weak because I chose not to be loud. They were currently learning that the most dangerous power is the kind you never see coming. Chad, pacing near the elevators, stopped abruptly. He pressed the phone tighter against his ear, his face draining of whatever color it had left. Margaret, he said, his voice cracking into the phone. Margaret, listen to me. I need you to contact the institutional clearing desk right now. You have to halt any margin settlements tied to my personal portfolio. Tell them it was unauthorized access. Tell them it was fraud. There was a pause as the person on the other end of the line spoke. The hospital corridor was so quiet that I could hear the faint, tinny sound of the secretary's voice coming through the receiver. What do you mean you cannot access the terminal? Chad asked, his voice rising in panic. Just override the system, Margaret. Use my executive credentials. Another pause. Chad's shoulders slumped forward as if an invisible weight had just been dropped on his back. He leaned heavily against the wall, slowly sliding down until he was practically crouched on the floor. I watched him as he listened to the voice on the phone. His arrogant posture was completely eradicated. The man who had just threatened to steal my family land, to liquidate my assets, and to force me back into poverty was now crumbling in a hospital hallway. What are you saying, Margaret? Chad whispered, the phone slipping slightly from his grasp. Who locked you out? Chad lowered the phone. He did not hang up. He just let his arm fall to his side, staring blankly at the polished linoleum floor. Trina ran over to him, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. "Chad, what is it?" she cried, her voice shrill with terror. "What did Margaret say? Call the bank. Fix this." Chad slowly lifted his head and looked at his wife. His eyes were completely hollow. He looked past Trina and stared directly at me. "I cannot fix it," he said, his voice completely devoid of life. "Margaret said the internal systems are down. Our firm was hostile, taken over an hour ago by an anonymous private equity group. The new ownership triggered an immediate asset freeze on all executive portfolios, pending a full federal audit. We are locked out of the system. I have no access to the funds. I have no access to the firm. We have absolutely nothing." The silence that followed Chad's admission was absolute and heavy. Trina stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth as she realized her luxurious lifestyle, her designer clothes and her high society status had just evaporated into thin air. Gloria slumped against the wall, her knees finally giving out as she slid to the floor, weeping for the loss of her precious image. Brittany stood frozen near the medical cart, staring at the power of attorney document on the floor, realizing she was now legally tethered to a paralyzed man with millions in fraudulent debt. I calmly retrieved my post-nuptial agreement from the cart, sliding it back into my leather handbag. I fastened the clasp and adjusted the strap on my shoulder. I looked at the three women and the broken man on the floor. "Excuse me," I said, my voice polite and perfectly even. "I am going to the cafeteria to get a cup of black coffee. Please let me know when the county transport ambulance arrives to collect Malik. I would hate to miss saying goodbye." I turned and walked slowly down the hallway, the steady rhythmic click of my black leather pumps echoing against the tile, the only sound in the corridor. I did not look back. I knew they were watching me walk away. I knew they were finally beginning to understand that the docile, uneducated housewife they had mocked for nearly 2 decades was the architect of their total destruction. And I knew the best part of the execution was still yet to come. I sat in the sterile hospital cafeteria, holding a paper cup of lukewarm black coffee. The bitter taste perfectly matched the reality my in-laws were currently choking down up on the 4th floor. I checked the gold watch on my wrist, giving them exactly 45 minutes to fully digest the magnitude of their ruin. Chad was likely still pacing the hallway, making frantic calls to lawyers who could no longer help him evade federal regulators. Gloria was probably sedated by now, unable to cope with the destruction of her pristine social image. And Brittany, well, I knew exactly what a cornered rat did when the ship began to sink. She would scramble for any remaining scraps to save herself. I finished my coffee and tossed the empty cup into a nearby trash can. It was time to return to the intensive care unit and witness the final act of this carefully orchestrated play. When I stepped off the elevator, the corridor was blissfully quiet. The screaming and crying had ended. The frantic energy that had consumed the family waiting area was completely gone. A passing nurse informed me that Chad and Trina had rushed out of the building looking physically sick, while an orderly had to escort a hyperventilating Gloria to her car. They had abandoned Malik the moment his perceived wealth vanished into thin air. Their loyalty was entirely transactional, and the account was now overdrawn. Only one person remained tethered to him now. I walked slowly toward Malik's private room. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. I stopped just outside the frame, listening to the rhythmic hum of the life support machines. Then I heard something else. It was the frantic sound of skin slapping against metal and heavy, panicked breathing. I pushed the door open without making a single sound. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the medical monitors. Malik lay motionless on the bed, a network of clear plastic tubes keeping him alive. Standing over him was Brittany. Her silk slip dress was wrinkled, and sweat plastered her blonde hair to her forehead. She was gripping Malik's left arm with both hands, pulling aggressively at his wrist. I stood in the shadows near the doorway and watched her struggle. She was trying to slide his custom $40,000 Patek Philippe watch off his paralyzed hand. She was sobbing quietly, cursing under her breath as the metal clasp snagged on his skin. "Come on, you selfish jerk," she whispered frantically, yanking at his wrist again. You owe me this. You completely ruined my life. I need this money to get out of here. I stepped into the light of the monitors, folding my arms across my tailored black blazer. That clasp requires a specific pressure point on the dual deployment mechanism, Brittany, I said, my voice smooth and loud in the quiet room. You are just going to bruise his skin, pulling at it like a wild animal. Brittany spun around so fast she nearly tripped over the clear plastic IV line taped to the floor. She gasped, clutching her chest, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She looked exactly like a thief caught with her hand inside a bank vault. Roxanne, she stammered, taking a large step back from the hospital bed. I was not stealing it, I promise. I was just keeping it safe. The hospital staff might take it while he is asleep. I walked closer to the bed, looking down at the man who had called me, plain and small-minded, just this morning. You do not need to lie to me, Brittany, I said calmly, examining the expensive watch still locked around his wrist. I know exactly why you are trying to pawn a $40,000 timepiece. The hospital billing director told you the daily intensive care rates, did he not? Brittany wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently despite the warm, controlled air of the hospital room. $15,000, she cried, her voice breaking as the tears began to fall. $15,000 a day, Roxanne. They said because I signed the proxy document, I am legally bound to the debt. I do not have that kind of money. My credit limit is barely $3,000. They are going to garnish my wages. They are going to take my car. I cannot be tied to a paralyzed man who has absolutely nothing. He lied to me. He told me he was a millionaire with limitless corporate resources. I listened to her pathetic whimpering, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the woman standing before me. She had happily paraded that power of attorney in my face when she thought it came with a mansion and a luxury lifestyle. She had stood by silently while my mother-in-law insulted my heritage and my character. Now she was buckling under the crushing weight of her own unchecked greed. I reached into my leather handbag and pulled out a neatly folded stack of paper. I did not pull out a phone to call the police. I did not threaten to report her for attempted theft. I simply held the papers out toward her, offering her a different kind of destruction. What is that? Brittany asked, wiping smeared black mascara from her pale cheeks. I suggest you read it, I replied, holding the stack steady. It is a printed email thread from 14 months ago. It is the direct correspondence between a prominent corporate headhunter and the human resources director at Malik's elite consulting firm. Brittany took the papers hesitantly, her hands shaking so badly the pages rustled together. She looked down at the top page. I watched her eyes scan the printed text. She frowned, looking entirely confused by what she was reading. This is the email thread regarding my initial recruitment, she said. This is the headhunter who found my profile online and fast-tracked my interview directly with Malik. Why do you have this in your purse? I tilted my head, studying her expression as the gears in her mind slowly began to turn. Look at the email address of the anonymous headhunter, Brittany, I instructed quietly. Look very closely at the corporate domain attached to the sender. She flipped to the second page, her hands trembling even more violently now. She read the email address aloud and then stopped completely. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at me, complete comprehension finally dawning in her tear-filled eyes. The domain name on the email perfectly matched the name of my private equity firm. The exact same firm that had quietly purchased the commercial buildings where Malik's company leased their office space. You, she whispered, dropping the papers onto the cold linoleum floor. You recruited me. I smiled, a cold, empty smile. I knew about his wandering eye years ago, Brittany. I explained, my voice perfectly, even and devoid of emotion. But Malik was unpredictable when he was bored. If I wanted to quietly separate our assets and restructure my corporate holdings without him noticing, I needed him to be entirely distracted. I needed a specific type of woman to keep him occupied. Someone young enough to inflate his fragile ego, ambitious enough to demand his constant financial attention, and foolish enough to believe his grand lies. You fit the psychological profile perfectly. Brittany backed away from me, shaking her head in utter disbelief, as the reality of her situation settled over her. You knew about the affair, she choked out, taking another step backward. You planned it all along. You literally threw me at him. I did not throw you anywhere, I corrected, smoothing a small invisible crease in my blazer. I simply opened a door for you. You chose to walk through it. You chose to sleep with a married man in expensive hotel rooms. You chose to mock his wife. You chose to sign a legal document demanding absolute control of his life and his finances. I just provided the stage, Brittany. You wrote your own tragedy step by step. She looked at the paralyzed man lying in the bed, and then back at me. Her chest heaved with panicked, ragged breaths. You are an absolute monster, she cried, her voice rising in pitch. You set him up to lose all his money, and you set me up to take all his massive debt. You completely ruined my life. I stepped closer to her, my commanding presence forcing her back toward the heavy wooden door. No, Brittany, I said softly, my tone dangerous and low. I protected my life and my daughter's future. You were just acceptable collateral damage in a corporate war you did not even know you were fighting. Now I highly suggest you run. The billing director will be back for his daily financial update very soon, and you have $15,000 to find before midnight strikes. Brittany did not say another word. She let out a muffled, terrified sob, turned on her heel, and sprinted out of the intensive care room as fast as she could. I heard the frantic, rapid click of her heels echoing down the long hospital hallway, growing fainter and fainter until there was nothing left but the steady, mechanical rhythm of the heart monitor. I stood in the silence for a long moment, letting the absolute peace of the empty room wash over me. The long, silent war was finally over. Gloria and Trina were publicly humiliated. Chad was facing federal ruin and the loss of his prestigious career. Brittany was permanently trapped in a financial prison of her own making. The vast estate I had built in the shadows was entirely secure, and my brilliant daughter Layla would inherit a legacy completely untainted by her father's reckless arrogance. I slowly turned back to the hospital bed. I walked up to the metal rail, looking down at the man who had tried to discard me like worthless trash just a few hours prior. I expected to see him unconscious, lost in a deep, medically induced sleep. Instead, I saw something that made a genuine, satisfied smile spread across my face. Malik's eyes were wide open. They were not glazed or unfocused, as one might expect. They were darting frantically back and forth, tracking my every movement with absolute terrifying clarity. The heart monitor beside the bed beeped slightly faster, betraying the intense panic rising in his chest. I leaned over the mattress, resting my hands on the cold metal railing. I looked directly into his wide, terrified eyes. The doctors had warned Chad about the potential neurological outcomes of a massive brainstem stroke, but Chad was too busy protecting his hedge fund to actually listen to the medical professionals. I had read the medical chart while the nurses were distracted out in the hallway. Malik was not in a coma. He was suffering from locked-in syndrome. He was fully conscious, fully aware of his surroundings, but entirely paralyzed from the neck down. He could not speak a single word. He could not move a single muscle. He could only blink. He had heard everything. He had heard his mother blame me for his condition and then abandon him the moment the money vanished. He had heard Chad realize the offshore funds were gone and flee the hospital in a blind panic. He had heard Brittany try to steal his watch and cry about the insurmountable medical debt she now legally owned. And he had heard me explain exactly how I orchestrated his total downfall by placing his mistress right in front of him. I reached out and gently adjusted the thin thermal blanket over his chest, playing the role of the devoted, caring wife one last time. You always said I was small-minded, Malik, I whispered, leaning down so only he could hear my words. You said I lacked ambition and drive. You wanted to be free of me so you could soar in Atlanta high society with a woman who matched your corporate vision. Malik's eyes darted wildly side to side, tears pooling in the corners and slipping silently down his pale cheeks. He was completely trapped inside his own body, a permanent prisoner of his own making. He had demanded freedom, and the universe had given him an eternity of absolute silence. He was now acutely aware that the plain cotton dresses he despised were simply camouflage for a financial empire he could never hope to touch. I reached over and gently patted his paralyzed hand, feeling the cold skin beneath my fingertips. "Well, darling," I said, my voice soft and dripping with sweet finality, "you are completely free now. Have a nice life." I turned away from the hospital bed, picked up my leather handbag from the chair, and walked out of the room. I did not look back. I had a massive empire to run and a brilliant daughter to raise, and for the first time in 18 years, my schedule was entirely my own. The quiet hum of the hospital elevator offered a brief sanctuary as I descended to the ground floor. I watched the digital numbers light up one by one, feeling a profound sense of tranquility. I had just left my paralyzed husband trapped in his own body, fully aware of his utter ruin. I had left his arrogant mother and his entitled sister weeping on the dirty linoleum floor of the intensive care unit. And I had left his young mistress bound to a mountain of medical debt she could never hope to repay. The war was over, but there was still one minor skirmish left to handle. I stepped off the elevator and followed the signs pointing toward the hospital cafeteria. The cafeteria was nearly empty at this hour. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the plastic tables and orange vinyl chairs. A few exhausted nurses sat in the corner, picking at wilted salads and staring blankly at their phones. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial bleach. I walked over to the self-serve beverage station and poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee. I did not add sugar or cream. I preferred the bitter taste. I paid the cashier with a crisp bill and carried my paper cup to a small table near the large windows overlooking the parking garage. I sat down, smoothing the fabric of my black trousers, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee was terrible, but it felt like the nectar of victory. I knew he would come looking for me. A man like Chad could never accept defeat without trying to claw back some semblance of dominance. He needed someone to blame for the total collapse of his financial universe. He needed a scapegoat to carry the weight of his own catastrophic failures. And in his narrow, prejudiced mind, the quiet black woman from the low country of South Carolina was the perfect target. It only took 10 minutes for him to find me. The cafeteria doors swung open with a violent thud. Chad marched into the room, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the tiled floor. He looked entirely unhinged. His signature fleece vest was zipped unevenly, and his pale skin was flushed with an angry mottled red. Sweat stained the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He scanned the room with wild, frantic eyes until he spotted me sitting peacefully by the window. He crossed the cafeteria in long, aggressive strides. He did not bother to pull out a chair. He slammed both of his hands down flat on my table, making my coffee cup rattle. He leaned over me, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged. He dropped the polite corporate facade entirely. The polished Wharton graduate vanished, and the desperate cornered racist emerged. "You think you are so smart, Roxanne?" He sneered, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You think you can just orchestrate a hostile takeover of my firm and walk away? You think you can ruin my life and put my wife on the street? I know exactly what you are. You are nothing but a common thief. You grew up with nothing, and you used my brother-in-law to steal your way into a world where you never belonged." I did not flinch. I took another slow sip of my coffee, looking up at him over the rim of the paper cup. I placed the cup back down on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge of a napkin. I let him speak. I wanted him to exhaust all of his useless anger. "I am not going down for this," Chad growled, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "I just got off the phone with my crisis management team. They are the best white shoe lawyers in the state of Georgia. They eat people like you for sport. I told them everything. I told them that you embezzled those funds from Malik's firm. I told them that you used your shell companies to siphon corporate assets and frame me for the margin call. You think you covered your tracks, but my lawyers are going to rip your little real estate holding company to shreds." He was practically spitting as he spoke, his words laced with a deep-coated hatred. "People like you always reveal your true nature." Eventually, he spat, wiping a bead of sweat from his upper lip. "You can wear the tailored suits and go to the charity galas, but underneath it all, you are still just a girl from the dirt roads. You are a street hustler playing dress-up. I am going to have my legal team freeze every single bank account you have. I am going to have you indicted for wire fraud and corporate espionage. When my lawyers are finished with you, you will not have a dime to your name. You are going to end up right back in the projects where you belong, begging for food stamps." He stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to reclaim his posture of absolute authority. He believed his own lies. He believed that his white privilege and his expensive legal connections could automatically overwrite the truth. He thought his aggressive posturing would make me cower and beg for mercy. He thought I was afraid of the justice system. I let out a soft, quiet sigh. I reached into my leather handbag and pulled out a small black leather notebook. I flipped it open to a page marked with a thin red ribbon. I did not look at Chad. I kept my eyes focused on my neat, meticulous handwriting. 047299918. Chad. I said, my voice completely flat and calm. Chad stopped breathing. His arms uncrossed and fell loosely to his sides. He stared at me, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What did you just say?" he demanded. I turned the page of my notebook. 611045823. I continued, ignoring his question. Account name, Blue Horizon Ventures. Domiciled at the Grand Cayman branch of the Royal Bank of Canada. Opened exactly 4 years and 2 months ago. Chad's face went completely slack. The angry red flush vanished, leaving his skin the color of dirty chalk. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Would you like me to continue, Chad?" I asked, looking up at him with a polite smile. "I have 5 more account routing numbers listed here. There is the Shell Corporation registered in the British Virgin Islands under your mother's maiden name. There is the blind trust in Zurich that you use to hide your annual performance bonuses from the IRS. And of course, there is the private holding account in Panama, where you funnel the money you have been quietly embezzling from Malik's consulting firm." Chad grabbed the back of the orange vinyl chair facing me. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the plastic. He looked like his legs were about to give out completely. How he whispered, his voice breaking into a dry rasp. "How do you have those numbers? Those accounts are encrypted. They do not exist on any domestic ledger." I closed my black notebook and placed it gently next to my coffee cup. "You spent the last decade underestimating me, Chad." I explained, my tone conversational and light. "You and Trina love to mock me at Thanksgiving dinners. You love to use complex financial jargon to make yourselves feel superior. You thought I was just a quiet, uneducated housewife who spent her days planting vegetables and reading romance novels. You never bothered to ask what I was actually doing when I sat in my sunroom with my laptop." He stared at me, trembling visibly now. He looked like a man watching a tidal wave crash toward his home, knowing he could not outrun it. "While you were busy bragging about your hedge fund at the country club, I was quietly acquiring digital analytics firms," I said. "I hired the best forensic accountants and data retrieval specialists in the country. I noticed the discrepancies in Malik's corporate ledgers 3 years ago. I saw the missing capital. I knew Malik was too arrogant to hide his money properly, so I started tracking the outward flow of his firm's assets. And do you know what I found, Chad?" He swallowed hard, unable to speak. He just shook his head slowly. "I found you," I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, icy whisper. "I found that the luxurious lifestyle you and Trina flaunt is entirely funded by stolen money. I tracked every single wire transfer you initiated from Malik's corporate accounts into your offshore trusts. You stole over $4 million from his clients to pay for Trina's luxury cars, your winter trips to Aspen, and your ridiculous country club fees. You thought you could hide the theft by burying it in complex derivative trades, but you left a digital footprint a mile wide." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "You told me earlier that you deal with complex legal contracts every day, Chad. You told me I was out of my league. But you are the one who embezzled millions from a federal entity. You are the one who triggered a catastrophic margin call by using stolen funds as collateral. Your entire life is a house of cards built on federal wire fraud and tax evasion." Chad slumped into the orange vinyl chair across from me. He buried his face in his hands, pulling at his hair. "Oh my God," he moaned softly. "Oh my God, you have everything. You are going to give this to the police. You are going to send me to federal prison." I picked up my coffee cup and took another sip. The bitter liquid tasted absolutely perfect. I do not need to give anything to the police, Chad, I said, setting the cup down. You already flagged yourself. When you tried to initiate that massive wire transfer in the intensive care unit, you tripped a federal banking alarm. Your accounts were already under surveillance by the Securities and Exchange Commission because of the hostile takeover my firm initiated this morning. You basically handed them a map to your embezzlement scheme. Chad lifted his head, looking at me with eyes full of absolute despair. You destroyed me, he cried, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. You took everything from me, Roxanne. My firm, my money, my life. You are a cold, ruthless monster. I smiled warmly at him. I am simply a woman who protects her garden, Chad. I pulled the weeds, that is all. Chad stood up unsteadily. He looked frantically toward the cafeteria exit. He was calculating his odds of escape. He was wondering if he could make it to the airport, if he could buy a ticket to a non-extradition country before the federal authorities froze his passport. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his expensive shirt, backing away from the table. I have to go, he stammered, turning toward the doors. I have to get out of here. I have to call Trina. We can leave. We can leave right now. He did not make it more than 3 steps. The heavy double doors of the cafeteria swung open in perfect synchronization. The noise of the hospital lobby spilled into the quiet room, but I barely registered the sound. My attention was entirely focused on the 2 men who walked through the doors. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in identical dark navy windbreakers. The bright yellow letters FBI were printed boldly across the back and left breast of their jackets. They moved with a calm, practiced authority, scanning the sparsely populated cafeteria. They did not look at the tired nurses. They did not look at the cashier. They did not even look at me. They walked in perfect unison straight down the center aisle, their heavy boots squeaking against the linoleum. They walked directly up to the man in the fleece vest, who was currently frozen in terror halfway between my table and the exit. The taller of the 2 agents reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather badge wallet, flipping it open to display a silver shield. He looked at Chad with an expression of complete professional detachment. Chadwick Sterling, the agent said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet cafeteria. Chad let out a pathetic whimpering sound, his shoulders collapsing as all the fight drained out of his body. He nodded slowly, unable to form words. We need to speak with you regarding insider trading, federal wire fraud, and the embezzlement of corporate funds, the agent said, stepping closer to Chad and reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. I picked up my coffee cup, leaning back in my chair, and took one final, highly satisfying sip as I watched the federal agents place my arrogant brother-in-law in handcuffs and march him out the door. The performance was flawless, and my calendar for the rest of the afternoon was completely clear. The quiet hum of the hospital elevator offered a brief sanctuary as I ascended back to the 4th floor. I watched the digital numbers light up one by one, feeling a profound sense of tranquility. I had just left my arrogant brother-in-law in the cafeteria facing federal agents and the absolute ruin of his fraudulent career. The war was effectively over, but there was still one final piece of business to attend to. I stepped off the elevator and followed the signs pointing toward the intensive care unit. The stark contrast between the quiet lobby and the chaotic medical ward was immediately apparent. The screaming and crying that had previously filled the waiting area had morphed into a frantic, desperate panic. The sleek, polished floor of the corridor was crowded with medical staff, moving with urgent purpose. I walked slowly down the hall, my black leather pumps clicking softly against the tile. I did not rush. I had all the time in the world. The heavy double doors to Malik's private recovery suite were propped wide open. Inside the room, the atmosphere was pure, unadulterated chaos. 2 large medical orderlies dressed in dark blue scrubs were actively unplugging the expensive monitoring equipment. They were preparing to transfer Malik from the luxurious specialized bed to a standard uncomfortable transport gurney. The hospital billing director stood near the door holding his thick clipboard and looking incredibly agitated. He was tapping his pen against the plastic board, shaking his head as he spoke to a floor nurse. The $50,000 surgical deposit had never been paid. Brittany had fled the building like a terrified mouse, abandoning the sinking ship the moment she realized the proxy document was a financial death sentence. Chad was gone, dealing with the total collapse of his stolen hedge fund. That left only Trina and Gloria to face the devastating reality of the unpaid medical bills. Trina was standing in the corner of the room, frantically tapping the screen of her designer smartphone. She was calling Chad over and over again, her face flushed with panic. She did not know that her husband was currently sitting in the back of a federal vehicle wearing handcuffs. She only knew that the money was gone and the hospital was demanding payment. Gloria was blocking the orderlies, waving her manicured hands and screaming at the top of her lungs. "You cannot move him!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse and desperate. "He is a partner-level corporate consultant. He has premium executive insurance. You cannot put my son in a low-income state facility. He belongs in this private suite. He requires the chief of neurosurgery." The billing director sighed heavily and adjusted his glasses. He looked at Gloria with a mixture of pity and extreme irritation. "Mom, I have explained this protocol to you 3 times," he said, sounding completely exhausted. The young woman who signed the financial proxy document fled the premises. The required surgical deposit was never authorized. Furthermore, the federal authorities have placed a hard freeze on all of the patient's financial assets due to a pending federal fraud investigation. We have absolutely no choice but to transfer him to the county charity ward. They will stabilize him, but we need this premium bed for a paying patient. The orderlies stepped forward, ignoring Gloria's frantic protests, and began to shift the tangled medical lines attached to Malik's paralyzed body. Trina dropped her phone, her hands shaking wildly. "Mom!" she cried out, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. "Chad is not answering his phone. It goes straight to voicemail every single time. I called his assistant and she said the federal agents just raided the hedge fund office. Mom, they locked the glass doors. We do not have any money to pay for this. Chad cannot cover the deposit. The accounts are completely frozen. We have absolutely nothing left." Gloria spun around, her face pale and streaked with ruined, expensive makeup. She looked out into the hallway and saw me standing there. I was leaning casually against the doorframe with my arms crossed, watching their entire empire of lies burn to ash. Just a few hours ago, this proud woman had slapped my shoulder and told me I was a useless country girl who anchored her brilliant son to the dirt. She had mocked my plain cotton dresses and my quiet lifestyle. Now she looked at me like a drowning sailor looking at a pristine luxury lifeboat. The arrogance drained from her face, replaced instantly by a raw, pathetic desperation. Gloria did not march toward me this time. She stumbled. Her knees hit the hard hospital linoleum floor with a sickening thud right at my feet. She grabbed the hem of my tailored black trousers, her heavy gold bracelets clinking loudly against my ankles. She looked up at me with wild, pleading eyes. "Roxanne, please." She sobbed, her pristine country club pride completely shattered into pieces. "Please, you have to help us. They are going to take him to the county hospital. They are going to leave him on a gurney in a crowded hallway. Please use your little savings. Use the money from your community garden projects. You have to have something hidden away in a bank account somewhere. You are his wife, Roxanne. You have to use your money to save my boy." I looked down at the weeping woman clutching my shoes. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not offer her a single word of solace or understanding. I simply took a slow, deliberate step backward, forcing her trembling hands to fall away from my clothes. "I am not his wife, Gloria," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any warmth. "You made that legal distinction very clear this morning. You said Brittany was his future. You said she was carrying his true heir, and that she belonged in his wealthy world. I suggest you go find the junior marketing associate and beg her to pay the massive hospital bill. I have absolutely no financial obligation here." Before Gloria could let out another agonizing wail, the heavy doors at the end of the intensive care wing slammed open. The sudden loud noise echoed sharply down the corridor, making the medical orderlies pause their work. Rapid, frantic footsteps pounded against the tile floor. It was Layla. My 16-year-old daughter was practically sprinting down the hall. She was still wearing her elite private boarding school uniform, a crisp white blouse and a pleated plaid skirt. Her heavy backpack bounced aggressively against her shoulders as she ran. Her youthful face was flushed red, and tears were streaming heavily down her cheeks. She looked like a terrified child rushing to her dying father's side. She pushed right past Gloria, who was still sobbing on the floor, and shoved past Trina, who stood frozen in total shock. Layla burst into the hospital room and threw her heavy backpack onto the linoleum floor. She ran straight to the side of Malik's bed, gripping the metal safety railing. Malik was still lying there, paralyzed, his eyes wide and tracking her every single movement. He could not speak or move a muscle, but the rapid, frantic beeping of his heart monitor betrayed the intense spike of panic rising in his chest. He likely thought Layla was there to scream at him for his infidelity, or perhaps he thought she was going to cry and beg him not to leave her. "Dad," she choked out, her voice trembling with raw, desperate emotion. She leaned over him so their faces were inches apart. "Dad, while you were gone, Mom." Malik blinked, his eyes darting wildly. He was bracing himself for a tragic, pathetic confession. He expected Layla to say that I was broken, that I was weeping on the kitchen floor, that I was entirely destroyed by his sudden departure and his cruel disrespect. But Layla did not say any of those things. Instead, her tears stopped instantly. The fragile trembling in her voice vanished completely. She stood up straight, smoothing her plaid uniform skirt with perfectly manicured hands. Her face went completely deadpan, mirroring the exact cold, calculating expression I wore every single day in the executive boardroom. She reached down and slowly unzipped her heavy black backpack. She did not pull out a school textbook or a homework assignment. She pulled out a thick, glossy corporate acquisition folder. The cover bore the distinct, bold black and gold logo of my private equity firm. Layla opened the heavy folder and flipped to a highlighted legal page. She looked down at Malik, whose eyes were now darting back and forth in pure, terrifying confusion. Mom did not just sit at home. "Dad," Layla said, her voice smooth and chillingly adult. "Mom has been working very hard. Mom is the anonymous founder and chief executive of the private equity firm that just bought out your entire consulting agency this morning. Your arrogant boss, the man you worship, he works for Mom now. He reports directly to her corporate board of directors. Your entire career is owned by the woman you thought was a simple maid." The digital heart monitor beside the bed began to beep significantly faster. The rhythmic sound grew loud and highly erratic, filling the small, sterile hospital room with the noise of his internal panic. Malik stared at his 16-year-old daughter, his pupils dilated in absolute sheer terror. He tried to move his head, but the paralysis locked him firmly in place. Layla casually turned another page in the glossy corporate folder, holding it up high so the paralyzed man could clearly read the official business letterhead. "And this hospital, Dad." Layla continued, her tone conversational but incredibly deadly. "This premium medical center that Chad was bragging about earlier today. It is owned by the Obsidian Health corporate network. Mom is the absolute majority shareholder of Obsidian Health. She bought the controlling financial stake 2 years ago while you were busy buying cheap diamond jewelry for your desperate young mistress." Layla leaned over the bed again, placing her hands flat on the mattress on either side of his shoulders. She looked directly into Malik's wide, panicked eyes, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute surgical precision. "You are lying in a bed she owns, in a building she owns, owing $50,000 to a medical company she owns." Layla whispered, her words slicing through the air like a scalpel. "You threw away your entire family because you thought you were a massive giant. But you are just a tiny little bug caught perfectly in Mom's web. She controls your medical care, your debt, and your entire miserable legacy." The heart monitor went absolutely wild. A shrill, frantic alarm began to sound from the machine as Malik's heart rate spiked into a highly dangerous territory. His face turned a deathly, sickening shade of pale. His eyes bulged, tracking back and forth between his teenage daughter holding the binding corporate documents and me standing calmly in the doorway with my hands in my pockets. He was locked entirely inside his own failing body, fully conscious and completely aware of his doom. He realized that the docile, uneducated country wife he had mocked and discarded for 18 years was actually a billionaire titan who controlled every single aspect of his miserable existence. He had confidently walked out of our home, demanding his freedom, and he had awakened as a permanent paralyzed prisoner in an inescapable empire I built in total silence. The sharp, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the room as Layla's words settled over the paralyzed man in the bed. Gloria shook her head violently, stepping forward with her hands balled into tight fists. She looked from her granddaughter to me, her face twisting with a mixture of sheer denial and aggressive rage. "That is a lie," Gloria screamed, her voice cracking. "That is a filthy, disgusting lie. You are just trying to terrorize my son while he is helpless. You do not own anything, Roxanne. You are a stay-at-home mother who plays in the dirt. You do not have the brains or the capital to buy a consulting firm, let alone an entire medical network. I am going to the nurse's station right now. I am getting the hospital director, and I am having you and this disrespectful child thrown out onto the street." Trina nodded frantically, pulling out her phone. "Exactly," Trina agreed. "You thought you could come in here and play corporate titan with some fake printed papers. Chad already told us. You are just a hustler. I am calling hospital security. We are family, and we are going to have you removed." I did not move a single muscle to stop them. I simply stood by the door, watching their pathetic scramble for control. Layla closed the glossy corporate folder and placed it back into her backpack, completely unbothered by their screaming. Before Trina could even dial the number for security, the heavy double doors of the intensive care suite swung wide open. Two men walked into the room dressed in impeccable tailored suits. They were not security guards. One was the chief of medicine, and the other was the executive hospital administrator. I recognized them both immediately because I had personally signed off on their annual performance bonuses just 3 weeks ago. Gloria immediately rushed toward them, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Thank God you are here," Gloria cried out, assuming they had come to save her. "This woman is harassing my son. She is making up insane lies and causing him severe emotional distress. You need to call security and have her permanently banned from this facility." The hospital administrator did not even glance at Gloria. He completely ignored the hysterical older woman, waving her hands in his face. He walked straight past her, stopping exactly 3 feet in front of me. The chief of medicine stopped right beside him in perfect synchronization. Both men bowed their heads slightly in a gesture of absolute professional respect. "Madam Chairwoman," the administrator said, his voice carrying a tone of utmost reverence. "We were just informed by the corporate board that you were on the premises. We wanted to personally apologize for any inconvenience you experienced during your husband's emergency admission. Do you have any specific directives for this patient's transfer or ongoing care protocols?" The entire room went dead silent. The only sound was the erratic, frantic thumping of Malik's heart monitor. Gloria stood completely frozen, her arms still raised in the air, pointing at nothing. Her jaw dropped open. So far it looked painful. Trina lowered her phone, her eyes darting between the two powerful hospital executives and me. They had demanded the hospital director kick me out, and instead, the director had just bowed to me and called me his boss. I offered the two men a brief, polite smile. "Thank you, gentlemen," I replied, my voice calm and authoritative. "I will handle the patient transfer directives personally. You may return to your duties." They nodded respectfully and exited the room without asking a single question. I turned my attention back to the two women who were now staring at me as if I were a terrifying alien species. I stepped fully into the room, walking past them to stand directly beside Malik's bed. He was staring at me, his pupils dilated in pure, unadulterated terror. "You see, Gloria?" I explained, my voice smooth and perfectly steady, "while you were busy making fun of my Southern heritage and praising Malik for buying flashy luxury cars on credit, I was busy building generational wealth. You mocked me for attending a neighborhood book club every Tuesday. You did not know that book club was a highly confidential board meeting for my private equity firm. You laughed at the community gardening grants I managed. You did not know those grants were actually multi-million-dollar commercial real estate acquisitions. I built an entire financial empire in absolute silence, while your son was busy playing dress-up for high society. Malik's eyes squeezed shut, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He had traded an empire for a cheap hotel room and a junior marketing associate. Suddenly, a sharp, buzzing sound cut through the heavy silence. It was Trina's cell phone. She looked down at the glowing screen, her hands trembling so violently she almost dropped it. She answered the call, her voice small and incredibly shaky. "Hello," Trina whispered. I watched her face as she listened to the person on the other end of the line. The color completely drained from her skin, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She slowly lowered the phone, pulling it away from her ear. "What is it, Trina?" Gloria asked, her voice panicked. "Who was that?" Trina looked at her mother and then looked directly at me. Her eyes were filled with absolute horror. "That was the membership director at the country club," Trina choked out. "He said, 'My family membership has been abruptly canceled. Effective immediately,' he said. 'The corporate sponsor V Holdings just withdrew all funding and ordered our permanent expulsion.'" I smiled a slow, cold smile. "I am the sole owner of V Holdings, Trina," I said quietly. "Your free ride is officially over." The heavy wooden doors of the intensive care room swung shut behind me, but the air inside was still thick with pure, unadulterated panic. I walked back into the room, my black leather pumps clicking softly against the sterile tile floor. I had just left Chad in the cafeteria facing federal agents and the absolute ruin of his fraudulent career. The war was effectively over, but there was still one final piece of business to attend to. My 16-year-old daughter Layla stood exactly where I had left her, calmly sliding the glossy corporate acquisition folders back into her designer backpack. She had delivered the final fatal blow to her father's ego with surgical precision. Malik lay frozen in his hospital bed, his eyes darting frantically back and forth. His heart monitor beeped in a rapid, erratic rhythm, betraying the intense terror trapped inside his paralyzed body. He knew he was lying in a bed I owned inside a hospital I controlled, owing a massive debt to a company where I was the majority shareholder. Gloria and Trina stood near the medical cart, staring at Layla, as if the teenager had just grown a second head. The arrogant superiority that usually twisted their features had completely evaporated. They looked from Layla to me as I stepped fully into the room, folding my arms across my tailored black blazer. They had heard Layla's absolute destruction of Malik's financial facade. They finally understood that the quiet, uneducated housewife they had mocked for 2 decades was actually a billionaire titan. The realization that I held absolutely all the power and all the wealth triggered an immediate and pathetic shift in their strategy. Gloria stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the wall while Trina stepped forward, her hands raised in a frantic, placating gesture. "Roxanne, listen to me." Trina began, her voice trembling with a forced, sickening sweetness that made my stomach turn. "Roxanne, you have to stop this. You cannot just take everything and leave us with nothing. We are family, Roxanne. We are blood." Gloria immediately nodded, stepping up right beside her daughter and clasping her hands together in prayer. "That is right, Roxanne." Gloria pleaded, her voice high and desperate. "We have to stick together. We are a Black family. You know how hard it is out there for us in this world. You cannot let a Black family fall apart like this. The system is designed to destroy us, Roxanne. We need unity right now. We have to protect our own people." I stood perfectly still, looking at the 2 women who had spent the last 10 years treating me like an unwanted servant. I let out a soft, humorless laugh that echoed sharply in the quiet hospital room. The sheer audacity of their sudden demand for racial solidarity was almost comical. "Black family unity?" I asked, tilting my head and locking my eyes on Trina. "You want to talk to me about Black unity right now, Trina? Where exactly was that profound unity for the last decade? You married a white Wall Street banker who spent every single Thanksgiving dinner making coded racial jokes at my expense. You sat at my dining table drinking my expensive wine, while your husband Chad openly mocked my low-country neighborhood and my background. You let a white man disrespect your brother's black wife for 10 years, and you never said a single word to stop him. You smiled and you nodded because he bought you designer shoes and luxury cars. You traded your supposed cultural unity for a country club membership and a zip code, Trina. Do not dare stand in front of me now and attempt to weaponize our race to save your overdrawn bank account. Trina physically shrank back, her mouth opening and closing silently, as the absolute truth of my words struck her across the face. She looked down at the linoleum floor, unable to meet my gaze. Gloria tried to intervene, stepping in front of her disgraced daughter. "Roxanne, please." Gloria begged, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. "I am Malik's mother. I am your mother-in-law. I have always wanted the best for this family. I always pushed Malik to succeed so we could all be elevated." I turned my cold gaze to Gloria, letting the ice in my eyes freeze her in place. "You wanted the best for your superficial image, Gloria." I corrected my voice, dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "You mocked my mother's heritage. You called my ancestral land a dusty patch of dirt. You called my traditional low-country cooking ghetto food because it did not look like the pretentious fine dining you saw in your society magazines. You actively praised a 25-year-old mistress because she carried a designer bag and wore expensive silk slip dresses. You cheered for the destruction of my marriage because you honestly believed Brittany would elevate your social status. You did not want a loving daughter-in-law, Gloria. You wanted a shiny accessory to show off to your shallow friends." Gloria began to sob openly, burying her face in her manicured hands. "We have nothing, Roxanne," she wailed, her voice breaking. "If Malik is ruined and Chad's accounts are frozen, we have absolutely nothing left. How are we supposed to live? Where are we supposed to go?" I reached into my leather handbag. I bypassed the post-nuptial agreement and the offshore bank records, pulling out 2 thick manila envelopes. I held them out, extending one toward Gloria and one toward Trina. "You should open these," I suggested calmly. Trina took her envelope with shaking hands. She tore the top open and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. Her eyes scanned the bold black print at the top of the page. I watched her knees literally buckle. She grabbed the edge of the metal medical cart to stop herself from collapsing onto the floor. "What is this?" Trina gasped, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "This is a notice of foreclosure." "Yes, it is," I agreed smoothly. "You see, Trina, you and Chad thought you were so brilliant, embezzling millions from Malik's firm to fund your extravagant lifestyle. But your massive suburban mansion was financed through a private corporate loan guaranteed by Malik's consulting agency. And Gloria, your luxury high-rise condominium in Buckhead, was purchased using the exact same financial structure. Malik used his corporate equity to secure both of your mortgages because neither of you actually had the legitimate income to afford them." Gloria snatched her envelope and ripped it open, staring at the matching foreclosure notice with wide, terrified eyes. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, clutching the paper to her chest as if it were a physical wound. "This is my home, Roxanne. You cannot throw an old woman out on the street. This is illegal. I do not own those loans anymore, Gloria." I explained, my tone perfectly polite and entirely detached. "My private equity firm acquired Malik's consulting agency this morning. We assumed all of the corporate assets and all of the corporate liabilities. And as the new majority shareholder, my very first official directive was to liquidate all non-performing loans to clear the books. Your mortgages are in severe default. My firm is foreclosing on both properties immediately. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the sheriff's department removes your belongings." The hospital room descended into absolute chaos. Trina was hyperventilating, clinging to the medical cart, while Gloria dropped to the floor, weeping hysterically over the foreclosure documents. Malik lay paralyzed in his bed, his eyes darting frantically, listening to his mother and his sister realize they were entirely homeless and financially ruined. Layla stood quietly by my side, her expression completely unbothered, as she watched the systematic destruction of the people who had treated us like garbage for her entire life. Then the heavy wooden doors of the intensive care room swung open once again. I turned, expecting to see the hospital billing director returning to collect his unpaid deposit, or perhaps the county transport team arriving to move Malik to the charity ward. Instead, I saw Chad. He looked like a man who had just crawled out of a violent nightmare. His expensive custom-tailored shirt was soaked in sweat and entirely untucked. His silk tie was gone. His face was pale and slick with heavy perspiration. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps, leaning heavily against the doorframe just to keep himself standing. Chad, Trina cried out, abandoning the medical cart and rushing toward him. "Chad, what happened? The federal agents, they took you away. Where have you been?" Chad pushed past his wife, completely ignoring her frantic questions. He stumbled toward the center of the room, stopping just a few feet away from me. He looked absolutely broken. The arrogant Wall Street executive who had threatened to seize my family land in the cafeteria just an hour ago was completely eradicated. "Roxanne," he panted, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. "Roxanne, please listen to me." I tilted my head, studying his pathetic, disheveled appearance. "How did you get away from the federal agents, Chad?" I asked, mildly curious about his sudden return. "I turned state's evidence," he blurted out, his voice desperate and high-pitched, echoing loudly over his mother-in-law's sobbing. "I told them everything, Roxanne. I gave them all the offshore account routing numbers. I gave them the names of the senior partners who helped me structure the illegal derivative trades. I gave them the entire embezzlement network. They let me walk because I cooperated, but my career is totally over. The SEC banned me for life. I have no money, Roxanne. The Fed seized every single account. We have absolutely nothing left." He dropped to his knees right beside Gloria, clasping his hands together and looking up at me with pathetic, pleading eyes. "Please, Roxanne," he begged, his voice cracking as tears streamed down his pale face. "I know you own Malik's firm now. I know you control the massive private equity portfolio. I need a job. I will do anything you ask. I will work as a junior analyst. I will fetch coffee for your executives. I will clean the corporate floors. Just please give me a job, Roxanne. I have a family to feed. We are going to be on the street." The room fell dead silent. Even Gloria stopped sobbing, staring in absolute shock as the wealthy white son-in-law she had worshipped begged a black woman for a minimum-wage job on his hands and knees. Trina covered her mouth with both hands, watching her husband humiliate himself in front of the woman he had spent a decade insulting. Malik blinked rapidly from his bed, entirely powerless to intervene as the last pillar of his arrogant world collapsed. I looked down at Chad. I looked at his sweaty face, his ruined expensive clothes, and his trembling hands. I thought about the decades of subtle insults, the condescending smirks, the blatant disrespect he had hurled at me in my own home. I thought about how he had just threatened to send me to prison and steal my ancestral land simply because he believed his race and his gender made him untouchable. I reached out and gently rested my hand on Layla's shoulder, feeling the solid, quiet strength of the daughter I had raised to be a titan. I looked back down at Chad and offered him a slow, polite smile. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Chad," I said, my voice ringing clear and incredibly steady in the quiet hospital room. "I do not hire people with criminal records." The silence in the intensive care unit was absolute and suffocating. Malik lay frozen in his luxurious hospital bed, his heart monitor still beeping in a frantic, erratic rhythm. He had just realized that the quiet, submissive wife he had discarded was actually the billionaire owner of the very medical network currently keeping him alive. Layla stood calmly by my side, her elite boarding school uniform perfectly pressed, as she held the glossy corporate acquisition documents that proved every single word. I kept my hands casually in the pockets of my tailored black trousers, watching the devastating reality wash over the people who had tormented me for almost 2 decades. Gloria and Trina were still standing near the door, perfectly rigid, as if they had been struck by lightning. The arrogant sneers that had twisted their features all morning had completely vanished. They stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding the sheer magnitude of the empire I had built in total silence. They realized that I held absolutely all the wealth and all the power. And like the predictable parasites they were, they immediately switched their tactics. The condescension evaporated, replaced instantly by a sickening, desperate warmth. Gloria took a step forward, wiping her ruined, expensive makeup from her cheeks. She forced a trembling, pathetic smile onto her face, holding her manicured hands out toward me. "Roxanne, please," Gloria began, her voice dripping with a fake syrupy sweetness that made my stomach turn. "Roxanne, we need to calm down and talk about this rationally. You cannot just take everything from us. We are your family, Roxanne. We are blood." Trina nodded vigorously, stepping up right beside her mother. She clasped her hands together in a frantic, pleading gesture. "That is right, Roxanne," Trina said, her voice pitching high and desperate. "We have to stick together now more than ever. We are a Black family. You know how hard it is out there for us in this unforgiving world. The system is designed to destroy us, Roxanne. You cannot let a Black family fall apart like this. We need community. We need Black unity right now to survive. We have to protect our own people." I stood perfectly still, looking at the two women who had spent the last 10 years treating me like a worthless, uneducated servant. I let out a soft, cold laugh that echoed sharply against the sterile tile walls. The sheer audacity of their sudden demand for racial solidarity was absolutely comical. "Black unity?" I asked, tilting my head and locking my eyes directly on Trina. "You want to talk to me about Black unity right now, Trina? Where exactly was that profound cultural solidarity for the last 10 years? You married a wealthy white Wall Street banker who spent every single Thanksgiving dinner making coded racial jokes at my expense. You sat at my dining table drinking my expensive wine while your husband Chad openly mocked my low-country neighborhood and my quiet background. You let a white man disrespect your brother's Black wife for a decade, and you never said a single word to stop him. You smiled, and you nodded, because he bought you designer shoes and luxury cars. You happily traded your supposed community for a country club membership and a prestigious zip code, Trina. Do not you dare stand in front of me now and attempt to weaponize our race just to save your overdrawn bank account." Trina physically shrank back, her mouth opening and closing silently as the absolute truth of my words struck her across the face. She looked down at the hard linoleum floor, entirely unable to meet my gaze. Gloria tried to intervene, stepping in front of her disgraced daughter. "Roxanne, please," Gloria begged, tears streaming down her face. "I am Malik's mother. I am your mother-in-law. I have always wanted the best for this family. I only pushed Malik because I wanted us all to be elevated." I turned my cold gaze to Gloria, letting the ice in my eyes freeze her in place. "You only wanted the best for your superficial image, Gloria." I corrected my voice, dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "Do not talk to me about family loyalty. You mocked my mother's deep Southern heritage. You called my ancestral land a dirty patch of dirt. You called my traditional cooking ghetto food because it did not look like the pretentious fine dining you saw in your society magazines. You actively praised a 25-year-old mistress because she carried a real designer bag and wore expensive silk slip dresses. You cheered for the destruction of my marriage because you honestly believed Brittany would elevate your pathetic social status. You did not want a loving daughter-in-law, Gloria. You wanted a shiny, wealthy accessory to show off to your shallow friends." Gloria began to sob openly, burying her face in her hands. "We have nothing, Roxanne," she wailed, her voice breaking into a loud, pathetic cry. "If Malik is ruined, we have absolutely nothing left. How are we supposed to live? Where are we supposed to go?" I did not offer her a single ounce of pity. I reached into my leather handbag and bypassed the medical proxy forms, pulling out 2 thick manila envelopes. I held them out, extending one toward Gloria and one toward Trina. "You should open these," I suggested calmly. Trina took her envelope with shaking hands. She tore the top open and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. Her eyes scanned the bold black print at the top of the page. I watched her knees literally buckle. She grabbed the edge of the metal medical cart to stop herself from collapsing onto the floor. "What is this?" Trina gasped, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "This is a notice of eviction." "Yes, it is," I agreed smoothly. "You see, Trina, you and Chad thought you were so brilliant living in that massive suburban mansion. But your home was entirely financed through a private corporate loan guaranteed by Malik's consulting agency. And Gloria, your luxury high-rise condominium in Buckhead, was purchased using the exact same financial structure. Malik used his corporate equity to secure both of your mortgages because neither of you actually had the legitimate income to afford them." Gloria snatched her envelope and ripped it open, staring at the matching foreclosure notice with wide, terrified eyes. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, clutching the paper to her chest as if it were a physical wound. "This is my home, Roxanne. You cannot throw an old woman out on the street. I do not own those loans anymore." "Gloria," I explained, my tone perfectly polite and entirely detached. "My private equity firm acquired Malik's consulting agency this morning. We assumed all of the corporate assets and all of the corporate liabilities. And as the new majority shareholder, my very first official directive was to liquidate all non-performing loans to clear the books. Your mortgages are in severe default. My firm is foreclosing on both properties immediately. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the sheriff's department physically removes your belongings." The hospital room descended into absolute chaos. Trina was hyperventilating, clinging to the medical cart, while Gloria dropped to the floor, weeping hysterically over the foreclosure documents. Malik lay paralyzed in his bed, his eyes darting frantically, listening to his mother and his sister realize they were entirely homeless and financially ruined. Layla stood quietly by my side, her expression completely unbothered as she watched the systematic destruction of the people who had treated us like garbage for her entire life. Then the heavy wooden doors of the intensive care room swung open once again. I turned, expecting to see the hospital billing director returning to collect his unpaid deposit. Instead, I saw Chad. He looked like a man who had just crawled out of a violent nightmare. His expensive custom-tailored shirt was soaked in sweat and entirely untucked. His silk tie was missing. His face was pale and slick with heavy perspiration. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps, leaning heavily against the doorframe just to keep himself standing. "Chad," Trina cried out, abandoning the medical cart and rushing toward him. "Chad, what happened? The federal agents, they raided the office. Where have you been?" Chad pushed past his wife, completely ignoring her frantic questions. He stumbled toward the center of the room, stopping just a few feet away from me. He looked absolutely broken. The arrogant Wall Street executive who had bragged about his stolen wealth just a few hours ago was completely eradicated. "Roxanne," he panted, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. "Roxanne, please listen to me." I tilted my head, studying his pathetic, disheveled appearance. "How did you avoid the federal raid?" "Chad?" I asked, mildly curious about his sudden return. "I turned state's evidence," he blurted out, his voice desperate and high-pitched, echoing loudly over his mother-in-law's sobbing. "I told them everything, Roxanne. I gave them all the offshore account routing numbers. I gave them the names of the senior partners who helped me structure the illegal derivative trades. I gave them the entire embezzlement network. They let me walk because I fully cooperated, but my career is totally over. The SEC banned me for life. I have no money, Roxanne. The feds seized every single account. We have absolutely nothing left." He dropped to his knees right beside Gloria, clasping his hands together and looking up at me with pathetic, pleading eyes. "Please, Roxanne," he begged, his voice cracking as tears streamed down his pale face. "I know you own Malik's firm now. I know you control the massive private equity portfolio. I need a job. I will do anything you ask. I will work as a junior analyst. I will fetch coffee for your executives. I will clean the corporate floors. Just please give me a job, Roxanne. I have a family to feed. We are going to be on the street." The room fell dead silent. Even Gloria stopped sobbing, staring in absolute shock, as the wealthy white son-in-law she had worshipped begged a black woman for a minimum wage job on his hands and knees. Trina covered her mouth with both hands, watching her husband humiliate himself in front of the woman he had spent a decade insulting. Malik blinked rapidly from his bed, entirely powerless to intervene as the last pillar of his arrogant world collapsed. I looked down at Chad. I looked at his sweaty face, his ruined expensive clothes, and his trembling hands. I thought about the decades of subtle insults, the condescending smirks, the blatant disrespect he had hurled at me in my own home. I reached out and gently rested my hand on Layla's shoulder, feeling the solid, quiet strength of the daughter I had raised to be a titan. I looked back down at Chad and offered him a slow, polite smile. I do not hire people with criminal records. Chad stared at me for one long, agonizing moment before the reality of his total destruction finally crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. He slowly lowered his head, staring at the hospital tile as the tears continued to track through the heavy sweat on his cheeks. He did not say another word. He simply pushed himself off the floor and shuffled out of the heavy double doors, a hollow, pathetic shell of the arrogant Wall Street executive who had terrorized my family for a decade. The sterile room was finally quiet. The orderly stepped forward, completely ignoring the weeping women in the corner, and began wheeling Malik's hospital bed out into the corridor. The dust of their shattered empire settled quietly around my black leather pumps as I watched them disappear down the hallway. 6 months passed, bringing a sweet and absolute justice to the people who had tried to bury me. The luxurious life Trina and Chad had stolen was completely eradicated. Trina no longer spent her afternoons sipping expensive champagne at the elite country club. Instead, she spent her days navigating the sticky floors of a deep discount grocery store on the edge of town. She pushed a rusted shopping cart with a squeaking wheel down the narrow, crowded aisles. She wore a faded, stained tracksuit instead of her signature designer dresses. She picked up generic brand cereal and carefully calculated every single penny, hoping she had enough loose change to cover her meager groceries. She remembered the days when she would throw away perfectly good food just because she craved something else. Now she was forced to check the expiration dates on heavily discounted bread. Her husband was faring much worse. Chad sat in a tiny gray fabric cubicle inside a windowless corporate call center. He wore a cheap, itchy polyester shirt and a heavy plastic headset. The man who used to command multi-million-dollar hedge funds was now forced to read a robotic apology script to angry customers over the phone. He spent 8 hours a day being yelled at by absolute strangers, while a teenage supervisor monitored his bathroom breaks. He was no longer the master of the financial universe. His arrogant Wall Street pride had been entirely stripped away, replaced by the crushing, suffocating reality of minimum wage survival. Gloria was banished to the exact kind of facility she had been so terrified Malik would end up in. She sat in a faded floral armchair in the corner of a linoleum-floored recreation room inside a basic state-funded nursing home. She wore a thin cotton gown that smelled faintly of industrial bleach and boiled cabbage. She grabbed the arm of a passing nurse, complaining loudly about how her son used to be a corporate king and how she used to live in a pristine luxury condominium in Buckhead. The nurse simply rolled her eyes, pulling her arm away from the frantic grip and walking down the hall without saying a single word. Gloria was left entirely alone, mumbling to herself about country club luncheons and high society friends who had completely forgotten her name. She was a miserable ghost haunting a plastic chair. Malik faced the most agonizing fate of all. He was transferred to a cramped 2-bedroom low-income apartment on the outskirts of the city. The walls were paper-thin, and the constant roar of highway traffic rattled the cheap glass windows. He lay completely flat on a narrow, uncomfortable medical bed, staring up at a yellowed ceiling where the paint was peeling in long, jagged strips. A single fat, black fly buzzed relentlessly around his face, landing directly on his cheek. He could not twitch a single muscle to swat it away. He remembered the days he felt like a giant walking through corporate boardrooms and demanding respect from everyone he encountered. Now he was a tiny, helpless bug, completely crushed under the weight of his own massive ego. He was permanently trapped inside the dark prison of his own failing body, forced to endure every sensory torment in absolute silence. The bedroom door slammed open, and Brittany marched into the room. She wore oversized sweatpants and looked entirely exhausted and furious. My legal maneuver had trapped her completely. Because Brittany had eagerly signed the financial power of attorney, she was legally bound to Malik's catastrophic medical debt. I had assigned his permanent care to the state, and she was mandated to act as his primary caretaker, unable to flee the absolute ruin she had helped create. She had traded her youth and her freedom for the illusion of wealth. Now she was paying the ultimate price, chained forever to a paralyzed man she despised. Brittany carried a cheap plastic tray, holding a bowl of cold, lumpy oatmeal. She slammed the tray down onto the bedside table, making Malik flinch internally. She glared at him with pure, unadulterated hatred, cursing the day she ever let him buy her a cup of coffee. She shoved a plastic spoon into the gray oatmeal, forcing it roughly into his mouth. Malik had to swallow the bitter, tasteless food while listening to the small television mounted in the corner of the room. On that television screen, my face appeared. I was standing on the grand, sweeping balcony of the Obsidian corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta. The magnificent Atlanta skyline stretched out behind me, a glittering kingdom of glass and steel. The warm Georgia sun shone brightly over the massive empire I had built from the ground up. Layla stood right beside me. She was no longer wearing her pleated boarding school uniform. She wore a sharp-tailored navy blue blazer that commanded immediate respect. She held a thick leather binder reviewing the final clauses of a multi-million-dollar international acquisition contract. Her brilliant young mind worked with flawless precision. She pointed to a line on the heavy parchment paper, explaining the financial leverage to me with total confidence. I looked at my daughter, feeling a profound sense of absolute pride. We had won the war, and we now owned the entire battlefield. Layla closed the leather binder and walked over to the edge of the balcony. She leaned against the thick glass railing, looking out over the bustling city streets far below us. The wind caught her hair as she turned her head to look at me. Her expression was calm and deeply curious. "Mom, why did you wait so long to show them who you really were?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly over the gentle city breeze. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my porcelain teacup, letting the rich, warm liquid soothe my throat. I looked out over the sprawling corporate network that belonged entirely to us. Because baby, a queen never interrupts her enemies while they are building their own guillotines, I told her. The brilliant sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over our empire as the world finally faded to black. The true lesson is that absolute power does not need to be loud, and that silent resilience is your strongest weapon against toxic relatives who constantly underestimate your worth. When people reveal their true colors through blatant disrespect, you should never waste your energy trying to change them. Instead, you must focus entirely on building your own empire in silence. Let your enemies destroy themselves with their own arrogance and greed while you protect your peace and secure your independent future. Share your own story about cutting off toxic family members in the comments below.